Hello and welcome to this Beowulf video in which I'm going to discuss reasons for teaching a particular translation of Beowulf. I am with my literary cat, Camille. There she is, very excited to discuss Beowulf. You can tell. She's wondering where all the cats are in the book. And I'm looking forward to hearing your comments about this. I don't think this is a super popular choice, and it's worth talking about. Why teach one translation of a text over another? So the translation I'm teaching this year is by Maria Headley, and a few years ago I read her novel Mere Wife, M-E-R-E Wife, and it's a modern retelling of Beowulf. And I was fascinated by it. And then I read that she was working on a translation of Beowulf, and I purchased it, and I was enamored of it. I've been teaching the Seamus Heaney translation for 20 or so years, and I think before that I taught Howell Chickering's bilingual translation. So a lot of this has to do with your philosophy about what a good translation is, and there's no agreement on this. If you want the most literal translation of Beowulf, I would go with either Howell Chickering's or Stephen Mitchell's. Stephen Mitchell also has a really good translation of the Iliad as well. And they're good, for their own reasons. Until recently, the most Anglo-Saxon feeling translation of Beowulf was probably Seamus Heaney's, which had lines, half lines that alliterated with each other, and it had some gorgeous imagery. I have to say, Maria Headley's what's being called a feminist translation, I think that's a misnomer in a lot of ways, but what's being called a sort of postmodern or feminist translation of Beowulf, it's fascinating. So I'm going to be promoting this as something to consider. Even if you're not going to teach it, absolutely read it. Just a heads up, I have 3 other Beowulf videos that that are more prefaces to experiencing the poem. I know a lot of adults who return to this poem long after high school, and I know most high school students in their British literature class have to read this poem. Here are some videos to help you sort of get used to the world of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and in this case of Beowulf. So the first video I would suggest, and these are all relatively short, I call Literary Archaeology and Why We Begin Our Class with This Poem. Because an obvious question everybody should ask is, why is the first great work of English literature not written in English and takes place in both Denmark and Sweden? So this video attempts to answer those things. Secondly, in an effort to compress what probably should be a much longer video on introducing us to the poem itself, I just choose 10 Anglo-Saxon words. And through learning about these Anglo-Saxon words, you get a real flavor for the culture of the poem. And then lastly, completely not necessary to read the poem, but if you're interested in history, it's fascinating that the existence of this book in our hands in the 21st century is literally, no hyperbole, literally a miracle. For reasons of invasion, for reasons of dissolution of the monasteries, and for reasons of a particular fire in the 18th century. That's a short video as well. So I would just check these videos out on YouTube. So here's the cover of Maria Headley's translation of Beowulf, which came out not long ago. And I've never taught it before. Like I said, I've taught Beowulf since 1998, and I've never taught this translation. And to be honest, I'm completely selfish. That's part of why I'm teaching it. Reading this translation of the poem was as if I was reading the poem afresh. And sometimes that's really good. Just like teaching a new text is really great, maybe a new translation of a new text was great. I taught Fitzgerald's translation of the Odyssey, and then I taught Fagles' translation of the Odyssey, and I'm really in love with teaching Emily Wilson's, which I've discussed in my Odyssey videos. So I have 3 primary reasons as to why you should pick up this book and read it. If you're teaching Beowulf, you should teach this translation. And if you're a student, maybe it's just good to know why your teachers are choosing this translation. First, something that teachers have to consider is, do I teach a translation that has literal translations of the words into modern English? Or if it's an either or do I teach a text that feels like the original, but in contemporary English? I know that seems like a false distinction, right? That poetry is made up of words, and if you just communicate the words accurately, that's enough. But I have to say, like, Howell Chickering's translation, and to a lesser extent, Steve Mitchell's translation, are very accurate, but there's a lot of moments that are almost sort of anesthetized, or they don't feel as strong and visceral in their modern English as the original does. And I, again, just as a proviso, I'm not an Anglo-Saxon scholar. I teach high school English. I was lucky enough to be able to take Anglo-Saxon in grad school and translate a lot of Beowulf. So I do have a little bit of proficiency in the original, but I don't claim to be an expert. I don't. I think Headley's translation communicates this Anglo-Saxon feeling. So part of that feeling of experiencing the poetry in the original is the strong alliterative language and just really multi-level imagery. They're big on auditory images. And here we go. This is Beowulf's soldiers, Beowulf's thanes, coming into a new mead hall, dropping off their weapons. They stacked shields, wood-weathered, against the walls, then sat down on benches, their metal making music. I love that, metal making music. That's really, really authentic and great. And then this kind of moment is the kind of moment that I think some teachers would object to. It takes a lot of liberties with the original. It's not unique in that way, but a lot of people want epic poetry to be very formal. The fact of the matter is, the language of Beowulf, aside from some very formal speeches, is very visceral and hits you in the gut. So Headley decides to communicate modern language that hits you in the gut, to communicate what the original might have felt like. So later in the poem, Beowulf needs help in a fight, and one of his comrades says to the other guys, "Bro, listen. Remember in the mead hall we swore to our Lord we'd stand by him? Get in the zone. He's falling. Do we watch him drop? No. Do we wait for his heart to stop, for him to die? No. Beowulf needs backup." And I can hear the objections. Bro isn't in the original. Get in the zone, that colloquial phrase, not in the original. Backup, not in the original. There also isn't a lot of internal rhyme, like drop and stop. That's almost reads like certain hip hop reads with internal rhyme. But I feel that the urgency communicated here to the modern ear is really authentic to the original. So I don't know. I think that's a really, really interesting reason to teach this translation. Secondly, and this is probably a whole separate set of podcasts, but I think it's great that a lot of us who've been teaching for a long time, who are educated in the canon, the old classic works of American and British literature, are now encouraged to consider voices that were ignored for a long time and the voices that are out now that don't get a lot of attention. So we're in education now are really encouraged to consider a more multicultural approach to our reading list, and that's great. The more really good books I can be exposed to, the better. I'm selfish when it comes to books. I do think an under-discussed phenomenon is that's great, including more female writers, more LGBTQ voices, more characters and writers of color. Absolutely. I care a lot also about ways to make canonical books come alive in a multicultural way. I know the Odyssey, particularly Emily Wilson's translation, really does this. I think Shakespeare is surprising in this. Dickens is surprising in this. Here, Headley, particularly her introduction, but in her translation too, has some really interesting ideas about what this over a millennia age book can remind us of or teach us. So here she says, in the book, by the way, Grendel's mother's gender, while it seems clearly female, is very confusing, I think, to the speaker of the poem. Anyway, here's what Headley says. As you know, if you know the poem at all, Grendel's mother is a formidable warrior and adversary. Headley says, I don't know that Grendel's mother should be perceived in binary terms, monster versus human. My own experiences as a woman tell me it's very possible to be mistaken for monstrous when one is only doing as men do, providing for and defending oneself. Whether one's solitary status is the result of abandonment by a man or because of choice, the reams of lore about single self-sustaining women, and particularly about solitary elderly women, suggest that many human women have been, over the centuries, mistaken for supernatural creatures simply because they were alone and capable. For all these reasons, I've translated Grendel's mother here as warrior woman, outlaw, and reclusive night queen. And I have to say, these are more accurate translations of what Grendel's mother actually is in the poem, in the Anglo-Saxon. Emily Wilson does this in the Odyssey, where the suitors' slaves, the women, sleep with some of the suitors, or Penelope's slaves, I should say, sleep with some of the suitors. And in older male translations, they're called sluts and whores and all these pejorative insults. But the word in Greek is slave. And calling them slave is not only more accurate, but it takes away moral agency from them because they don't have any. They're property. And here, Grendel's mother being called a warrior puts her in a different category in mental space as we're reading than calling her hell bride and, hell dam and all these really pejorative words that Haney and others translate her as. So again, just a really interesting idea that something this old can be relevant to a lot of these conversations we're having now about multiculturalism. So that's my second reason to teach this translation. And third, and most concretely for you English teachers, Headley's introduction is almost like, does so much work for you. Usually I give my students, we come up with a list of writing prompts after a book and the kids pick, and then one of them is a writing prompt of your choice. I like kids writing about things that they noticed as they were reading. I don't like to give them canned stuff to write about. It's very inauthentic, I feel. It's also more interesting to read if there's 15 choices. You're not reading the same paper over and over again. So here are just some things that I could see students writing more about. And this list is like almost infinitely long, but these are just three. The poem is, after all, a poem about willfully blinkered privilege, about the shock and horror of experiencing discomfort when one feels entitled to luxury. Right? Think about questions of privilege and entitlement now in the news and in kids' lives and social media. And imagine giving them the chance to look at that issue, but through a totally different lens, through the lens of this, early English poem. I think it's really interesting to think about. Secondly, Beowulf is a manual for how to live as a man, if you are, in fact, more like the monsters than the men. I love that she puts that in the same sentence there. It's about taming wild, solitary appetites and about the failure to tame them. I know a lot of my students, freshmen, after reading the Odyssey, write about whether or not the Odyssey, and more specifically Odysseus, can be a sort of handbook for how to be or not be a man. Be interesting to think about that in terms of Beowulf, too. And then lastly, Grendel's mother doesn't behave like a monster, and she really doesn't. She behaves like a bereaved mother who happens to have a warrior's skill. So I can imagine kids writing about privilege, writing about masculinity, writing about gender. There aren't any modern multicultural topics that this poem doesn't honor, acknowledge, and really help us flesh out. So anyway, those are a few reasons why I'm really excited to teach this translation. I have to say my main reason, completely selfishly, is that it's a reinvention of the poem for myself. And I'm just, I'm super excited to do it. So I hope this video helps you, and good luck with your reading.